Don't take it personal, Jaylene. Tapping on a keyboard at the Criminal Investigation Division doesn't exactly show you what real pressure looks like. The life and death operations in my special unit? That's a world you'll never touch. The condescending voice of Daisy, my own sister, cut through the Thanksgiving dinner table, sharp as a blade scraping against my eardrum. My mother sat next to her, nodding with bloated pride before shooting that familiar, pitiful glance my way. I gripped my red wine glass until my knuckles went white. I, a real CID captain who bled in sweat for my rank, was being publicly humiliated by my sister just to polish her elite officer facade. Just as I bit my lip, ready to swallow the shame like I had for 28 years under the shadow of the golden child, Elias, my fiancé, an actual Special Forces captain, leaned in. His cold breath brushed my ear. "She's lying," he whispered. My heart skipped a beat. With an investigator's instinct, I instantly recognized that his deadpan tone wasn't a joke. And that was the moment I knew the perfect 3-year-long illusion of the Burton family was about to be ripped to shreds. The echo of Elias's whisper hung in the heavy garlic-scented air. "She's lying." My smile froze. The muscles in my jaw locked tight. I forced my fingers to uncurl from the stem of my wine glass, releasing the pressure just a second before the thin glass could shatter in my hand. I shifted into the cold, detached space in my head. The investigator's mindset. I narrowed my focus, scanning the cramped dining room like a crime scene. Across the table, Daisy chewed a mouthful of turkey dripping with brown gravy. She waved her fork in the air, spinning some wild tale about a high-stakes data encryption shift. The stifling heat from the corner radiator pushed her cheap vanilla perfume across the table, mixing with the sickening smell of roasted meat and heavy grease. It was nauseating. My mother leaned forward, practically hanging on Daisy's every word. Beside her, my father Robert tapped his silver fork against his porcelain plate in a steady rhythmic beat. Clink, clink, clink. The sharp sound grated against my nerves like sandpaper. He nodded, his tired, grease-stained eyes shining with a blind, desperate kind of pride. Neither of them looked my way. I didn't exist. Not here. Mom shoved the bowl of mashed potatoes toward me, her eyes finally landing on my face. It wasn't a look of warmth. It was sheer pity. "Jaylene, you really should take notes from your sister," she said, her voice dripping with that fake syrupy sweetness. "Your desk job at the investigation division is fine and all, but Daisy is protecting national security. She handles a kind of pressure you couldn't possibly imagine." I pulled my hands off the oak table and rested them in my lap. The stiff cotton of my long-sleeved shirt dragged against my left forearm. Beneath the fabric sat a thick, ugly scar, jagged, torn muscle from a weapons smuggling raid last year. A permanent reminder of real blood spilled on cold concrete. Nobody at this table had ever asked about it. My mother had only complained that the injury ruined my posture. Instead, their eyes were glued to Daisy. She sat there in an olive green t-shirt she probably bought off the internet, sporting a generic Special Operations logo. A cheap costume for a cheap act. I kept my mouth shut. I picked up my fork and scooped a single green pea. Silence was always my armor in this house, but Elias wasn't built for their games. He casually picked up his linen napkin and wiped the corner of his mouth. He set it down, aligned the edges perfectly parallel to his plate, and leaned back in his wooden chair. His eyes locked onto Daisy. "So, Special Communications," Elias said. His voice was low, deadpan, even. There was zero threat in his tone, just casual curiosity. "Does your unit use UHF frequency hopping, or do you stick to Ku-band satellite encryption for those fast reports?" The dining room went dead silent. My parents stopped chewing. They stared at Daisy, their faces glowing with anticipation. They were waiting for a blockbuster movie answer from their golden child. I watched Daisy's right shoulder twitch, just a fraction of an inch. Her eyes darted hard to the left and locked onto the wallpaper for a split second. A textbook involuntary reflex, the brain desperately searching for a lie. She swallowed hard. The confidence drained from her face, replaced by a sudden paleness. She cleared her throat and hastily pushed her half-eaten plate of turkey away. "Come on, Elias. You know the security rules," she stammered, her voice pitching half an octave too high. I can't exactly discuss frequency encryption at a family dinner. She forced a wide plastic smile. Her hand reached for her glass of ice water. The ice cubes clinked against the glass. Her fingers were shaking. Elias didn't press her. He didn't have to. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. His expression was completely blank, but he lowered his hand to the edge of the table. Tap, tap. Two quiet knocks of his knuckles against the wood. The signal was loud and clear. The trap had snapped shut, and the golden child was bleeding out right in front of me. I slammed the heavy door of the Ford F-150, locking the suffocating laughter and clinking glasses of the dining room behind me. Snow had started to fall, fat, wet flakes hitting the windshield. I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a rough rumble cutting through the dead quiet of the street. I cranked the heater dial all the way to the right. The blower motor whined, blasting hot air into the cab. I was still freezing. The chill wasn't in the air. It was buried somewhere deep in my chest. Elias sat in the passenger seat. He didn't adjust the vents. He didn't reach for the radio. He just stared straight ahead into the dark. I threw the truck into drive and pulled away from the curb. We drove in absolute silence for 15 minutes. Past the rusting chain-link fences, past the abandoned steel mills that lined the outskirts of Pittsburgh like giant rotting teeth. The rhythmic thump-thump of the windshield wipers was the only sound in the cab. I couldn't shake the image of my mother's face, the way she looked at Daisy, like my sister hung the moon, and the way she looked at me, like I was something scraped off the bottom of a boot, all because of a story. A fake glossy story my sister was spinning while I dragged real scars to the dinner table. I jerked the steering wheel hard. The heavy tires crunched over the icy asphalt as I pulled into the lot of a boarded-up gas station. I slammed the shifter into park, yanked the parking brake up. I turned my head. My fingers dug into the freezing leather of the steering wheel. "Talk," I said. Elias finally turned to look at me. The sickly yellow light from a single street lamp bled through the window, cutting sharp shadows across his jaw. His demeanor shifted. The polite fiancé from the dinner table was gone. He was locked in, all business. The encryption process she was bragging about while passing the gravy. Elias started, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. "That's a plotline from a streaming movie that came out last month. Nobody communicates over that kind of chain. It's fiction." He paused, letting the words sink in like stones in a pond. "And her reaction to the Kuban question," he continued. "The lowest-level communications clerk knows exactly how to deflect that without breaking a sweat. She panicked because she didn't know the vocabulary." I squeezed my eyes shut. I rubbed my forehead, the dull throb of a migraine starting to build behind my temples. I needed a loophole. Just one string to hold this family together. "Maybe she's stuck in a back office sorting logistics," I said. My voice sounded weak, pathetic. "Mom says she's been at that installation for 3 years. She has to be doing something." Elias slowly shook his head. The look in his eyes was brutal. Total, unvarnished pity. "Jaylene," he said quietly, "I've been stationed at that exact facility for the last 4 years. It's a small footprint. I know the face of every single woman working cleared communications in that building." He leaned closer. The truth hit me like a physical blow. "There is no Daisy Burton. Your sister doesn't exist in our world." My lungs seized. The air vanished from the truck cab. She wasn't just lying to me. That would have been normal. That would have been just another Tuesday in the Burton house. She was lying to my father who hid his muscle relaxers under the seat of his truck so he could drag his ruined spine to a double shift at the metal plant. She was bleeding him dry, cashing in on his sweat and pain to fund a fantasy. She was making a mockery of everything I had actually done, everything I had actually bled for. I let go of the steering wheel. I reached down and shoved the shifter back into drive. "If you're wrong," I said, my voice dropping to a low, hollow rasp. My eyes locked onto the yellow dividing line glowing in the headlights. "This ends tonight. We never speak of it again." I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the slush before biting into the pavement. "But if you're right," I whispered, "I'm peeling that fake shirt off her back myself." The truck tore through the freezing night, speeding toward my apartment. The hunt was on. The clock on the microwave blinked 2:00 a.m. I sat at the scratched Formica kitchen table, flipping open my heavy-duty, rubber-edged work laptop. The hinges groaned in the dead quiet of the apartment. The smell of old grease and stale winter air still clung to my coat. Elias stood a few feet away, his back pressed against the humming refrigerator. He had his arms crossed over his chest, waiting. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out my government smart card. The plastic was worn, the edges frayed from 3 years of getting shoved into card readers. I earned this card. 18 months of brutal physical evaluations. 3 separate background checks tearing through my entire life, crawling through the dirt just to get clearance. Daisy hadn't done a fraction of that. I slid the card into the side of the laptop. Click. The personnel database login screen popped up. I typed my 8-digit PIN. The mechanical keys clacked like dry bones breaking in the silence. I typed in her full name, Daisy Marie Burton, date of birth, social security number. A gray loading bar crawled across the screen. I held my breath. The bitter cold coffee I drank an hour ago burned the back of my throat. The screen flashed white. A digital file materialized, bathing my face in a harsh blue glow. I stared at the top corner of her profile. Empty. No rank insignia, no official emblem. Just a blank gray box where a seal of honor should have been. My eyes dropped to the center of the screen. Right there under her name was a single line of italicized bright red text. It burned into my retinas. Status, not active duty. My chest tightened like someone had just taken a swing at my ribs with a baseball bat. I pressed my lips together so hard I tasted copper. She wasn't in the service. She hadn't been for 3 years. Every story. Every late-night phone call bragging about her high-stakes overseas operations. Every time she let my father puff out his chest, ignoring his terrible back pain, to brag to the neighbors on the porch. It was all a ghost story. My finger hovered over the mousepad. I scrolled down to her employment history. The sick feeling in my stomach hardened into pure ice. Classification: third-party contractor. Title: mailroom clerk. Assignment facility: postal sorting, a mail clerk. A girl who swept up junk letters and shoved packages into cardboard boxes. That was her pressure. That was her sacrifice. She got a third-party badge slapped on a fake olive green shirt and played dress-up. She used a mailroom pass to walk through the gates, take some selfies by the fence, and feed off my parents' blind worship. My hands started to shake. Not from sadness, from absolute, unadulterated disgust. I slammed my fist down on the table. The heavy ceramic coffee mug rattled against the wood, splashing dark liquid over the edge. Elias didn't flinch. He just watched me, letting me process the betrayal. Look at the bottom, I told myself, my voice a raspy whisper. I scrolled to the final section of her file. Facility access sponsor. The name of the person who signed the paperwork to let a third-party hire inside the gates. Sarah Jenkins. Of course. Sarah was her roommate from her short, miserable stint at the officer training program. The pieces slammed together in my head. A perfect, pathetic little racket. Sarah gets a desk job, sponsors Daisy as a mail sorter, and feeds her enough technical jargon to come home and humiliate me at the dinner table. 3 years of spitting on the uniform I bled for. I reached out and slammed the laptop shut. The heavy screen snapped down with a sharp crack that echoed off the kitchen walls. I had the lie, I had the accomplice. But a puzzle is nothing without the edge pieces. Daisy didn't just wake up one morning and decide to sort mail. She went to the training program 3 years ago. Something happened out there, something broke her. I needed to know exactly how the golden child got kicked out of the mud. It was noon the next day. The temperature had plummeted to 28 degrees. I told my mother I needed to grab a heavier coat from the truck. I pulled open the heavy door of the Ford and slid onto the freezing vinyl seat. I slammed the door shut, cutting off the sound of the wind whistling through the bare oak trees. I didn't touch the keys. I didn't turn on the heater. I just sat there in the biting cold. My breath formed thin white clouds that fogged the glass. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My thumb hovered over the screen. I had called in a favor with a colleague from the Federal Investigation Division that morning to track down a specific internal number. I dialed. The line clicked. Static crackled through the speaker before it started to ring. 2 rings. Disciplinary training office. The voice on the other end was rough, dry as sandpaper. It belonged to senior instructor Marcus Thorne, the kind of guy who chewed up weakness and spit it out before breakfast. Instructor Thorne, this is Investigator Jaylene Burton, I said. My voice was steady. I rattled off my federal badge number, establishing authority immediately. This wasn't a social call. I need internal records on a former trainee from your program. 3 years ago. Name is Daisy Burton. The line went dead quiet. Just the low hum of static. Then a heavy sigh. The sharp squeak of an old office chair leaning back. Burton. Thorne's voice dropped an octave, the professional courtesy vanishing, replaced by a razor-sharp edge. You telling me that recruit is your family? Yes, I said. I stared straight ahead at the frosted steering wheel. I need to know how she graduated. A harsh barking laugh scraped through the speaker. Graduated? Thorne scoffed. He sounded almost insulted. Investigator, your sister didn't make it past week 3. My fingers tightened around the phone. The plastic creaked. It was the heavy pack endurance run. Thorne continued, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. Mud up to their knees, pouring rain. She dropped her gear, threw her helmet right at my boots, sat down in the dirt, and bawled like a toddler begging to go home. My stomach turned over. I remembered my own training, dragging myself under barbed wire with 2 fractured ribs, biting through my own lip just to keep from screaming. I didn't quit. I earned my title in blood. Daisy threw a tantrum in the mud. I personally signed her voluntary withdrawal forms. Thorne said, his voice hard, final. She quit, packed her bags that same afternoon. She has never worn a single stripe on her shoulder. A bitter metallic taste flooded my mouth. The sheer pathetic cowardice of it all crawled up my spine like a physical illness. She wasn't just a liar, she was weak. And she had taken that weakness, wrapped it in a stolen uniform, and used it to steal every ounce of respect in our house. I understand, I said. My voice was completely flat. Thank you, instructor. I hung up. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. It bounced once against the cold leather. I leaned forward, wiping a circle through the condensation on the windshield with the sleeve of my sweater. Through the clear patch of glass 20 yards away, I had a perfect view of the kitchen window. Daisy was standing by the sink. She was laughing, tossing her hair over her shoulder. In her hand, she held a large ceramic coffee mug. Printed right on the side of it was a bold official government insignia. A mug she hadn't earned, a title she had quit on. The heat of my anger evaporated. It didn't fade away. It crystallized. It hardened into a solid, heavy block of ice right in the center of my chest. I reached for the door handle. The investigation was over. It was time for the execution. Lunch was over. The kitchen was still hot, smelling like overcooked turkey and stale pie crust. I didn't wait for my mother to start assigning dishes. I grabbed Daisy by the elbow. I used the hard, unyielding grip they taught us for restraining non-compliant individuals. My fingers dug right into the nerve. I yanked her backward, dragging her out the back door before she could even process what was happening. I pulled her across the frozen yard straight to the old woodshed, out of sight from the kitchen window. The crusted snow cracked and popped under my heavy boots. Daisy wrenched her arm away. She stumbled against the rough wooden siding of the shed, rubbing her elbow. She glared at me, reaching up to adjust the collar of that counterfeit unit t-shirt. Still playing the part, still acting superior. Are you out of your mind? She snapped, her voice shrill, cutting through the freezing wind. What the hell are you dragging me out here for? I didn't say a word. I reached inside my heavy winter coat. I pulled out the thick stack of papers I'd printed from the government database at 2 a.m. I had rolled them into a tight cylinder. I threw it, hard. The heavy roll smacked dead center into her chest. She gasped, her hands flying up too late. The papers unrolled in the air, fluttering down to the dirty snow around her boots. Third-party mailroom clerk, I said. My voice was dangerously low, sharp enough to cut glass. Status, not active duty. Voluntary withdrawal from the academy, week 3. Daisy froze. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax doll. Her eyes darted wildly, staring at the printed pages scattered on the snow, then back up at me. Senior Instructor Thorne says hello, by the way, I added. Golden child. For a second, I thought she might actually throw up. Her breathing turned shallow, turning into small panicked gasps that plumed white in the cold air. But the sheer stubborn entitlement in her wouldn't let her just fold. She actually took a step back and pointed a shaking finger at the papers. You don't understand, she fired back, her voice cracking. That's a cover. Sarah Jenkins is my supervisor. She set up that dummy profile to protect my identity. You know how this works, Jaylene. The cheap, pathetic lie made my stomach physically turn. Shut up! I closed the distance between us in 2 strides. I shoved the flat of my palm against her shoulder, pinning her hard against the freezing wood of the shed. The old boards groaned under the impact. Sarah Jenkins is a third-party hire, I hissed, leaning in so close she couldn't look away from my eyes. She pulled some strings to get you a job sorting junk mail just so you could get a gate pass. She fed you some phony government lingo so you could come home and put on a show. Daisy's eyes welled up with tears. Real tears this time. Panic. You used the uniform to play dress-up for 3 years. I asked, my voice vibrating with absolute disgust. While Dad breaks his back working double shifts. Daisy's knees gave out. She slumped down, sliding against the rough wood until she hit the snow, burying her face in her hands. Have you ever caught someone in a lie so massive it completely shattered how you saw them? If you have, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Just tell me what the lie was about money, cheating, or faking an entire life like this. I read every single one, and trust me, I know how that betrayal feels. I didn't reach down to help her up. I stood over her, crossing my arms, letting the freezing wind whip around us. Why didn't you just tell the truth? I demanded, staring down at the top of her head. Why didn't you tell them the day you walked out of the academy? My question acted like a drill bit hitting a pressurized nerve. Daisy looked up from the snow. Her eyes were bloodshot. Thick streaks of expensive mascara ran down her pale cheeks, ruining her perfect manufactured face. The sheer panic had cracked, revealing something raw underneath. Because of Dad, she screamed, her voice breaking into a ragged sob. Because of the night shifts at the steel plant. I didn't move. The freezing wind bit through the sleeves of my coat. Where do you think the money came from, Jaylene? Daisy choked out. She dug her fingers into the dirty snow, her acrylic nails scraping against the frozen dirt underneath. The private tutors, the personal trainers. All the gear I needed just to pass the entrance exams. I stared at her. The anger that had been boiling in my blood for 24 hours suddenly felt like it hit a brick wall. He hid his spinal degeneration from Mom. Daisy said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She sounded utterly broken. He begged for graveyard shifts down in the smelting section. 2 straight years of breathing toxic fumes and ruining his back just to pay for my chance. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I suddenly remembered dinner last night. The way my father's hand trembled slightly when he cut his meat. The way he kept shifting in his wooden chair, quietly grinding his teeth against the pain in his lower back. I had been so consumed by the injustice directed at me, I hadn't looked closely enough at him. I found his pay stubs, Daisy said, her tears dropping onto the snow. I found a stash of muscle relaxers shoved under the driver's seat of his truck. He was killing himself for me. The sickening reality washed over me. The favoritism. The blind pride. It wasn't just them hating me. It was them throwing every last ounce of their existence into a single gamble. A gamble named Daisy. And then I threw it all away in 3 weeks because I was too weak. Daisy bawled, her chest heaving. You want me to go home, look at his hunched back, and tell him his favorite daughter quit because the mud was too dirty? Because somebody yelled at her? She shook her head violently. I couldn't do it. I'd rather be a liar than see the look in his eyes when he realizes he destroyed his spine for nothing. I stood there in the freezing air, dead silent. The vindictive high of the hunter completely vanished. It was replaced by a crushing, suffocating weight. Her lie didn't start as a stage to mock me. It started as a shield to protect a broken father. And then it became a prison she couldn't escape. The sheer tragic stupidity of this family was enough to suffocate a person. I pulled the collar of my coat tighter around my neck. I looked down at my sister. The golden child was gone. She was just a scared, pathetic kid sitting in the dirt. "Tomorrow morning," I said. My voice was dry, hollow. "You are going to sit at the kitchen table, and you are going to tell Mom and Dad every single thing." Daisy didn't argue. She just stared at the ground, shivering violently. "If you don't," I added, my tone turning to iron, "I will do it for you." I turned my back on her and started walking toward the house. The snow crunched under my boots. "Jaylene." Her voice was tiny, trembling. I stopped, not looking back. "Will you sit next to me?" she asked. I closed my eyes. I pictured my father's grease-stained hands. I pictured the fake insignia on her coffee mug. "Yes," I said. The next morning felt like a lie. The kitchen was warm. It smelled like toasted bread, melting butter, and strong black coffee. My father sat at the head of the oak table, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. The local newspaper rustled as he turned the page. By the counter, my mother hummed softly, scraping a butter knife against a piece of toast. A picture-perfect family. A routine they had played out every single morning for 20 years. I pulled out a chair and sat next to Elias. My palms were damp, cold sweat. We were sitting on a bomb, watching the timer tick down to 0. Then the slow dragging sound of footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs. Daisy walked into the kitchen. She wasn't wearing the fake operational logo shirt. She wasn't wearing a camo jacket. She wore an oversized, washed-out gray sweater that swallowed her frame. Her face was entirely bare, pale. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. She looked hollowed out, like someone had drained the last drop of life from her veins. She walked over to the table and pulled out the chair directly across from my father. She sat down. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Elias. "Dad." "Mom," she said. Her voice was raw, rough like she had swallowed glass. My mother paused, the butter knife hovering over the toast. My father lowered his newspaper just a fraction of an inch, peering over the rim of his glasses. "I need to tell you something." Daisy swallowed hard. Her hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. "And I need you to let me finish. Don't interrupt me, because if I stop, I won't have the guts to start again." The newspaper in my father's hands slowly lowered all the way to the table. Silence hit the kitchen. Heavy, suffocating. The kind of quiet that rings in your ears right before a car crash. And then she spilled it. She didn't try to soften the blow. She didn't try to hide behind excuses. She just ripped the bandage off. I sat completely still, watching it happen. She talked about the mud at the training academy. She talked about throwing her gear in the dirt and quitting on week 3. Her voice shook as she explained the mailroom job, the third-party hire forms, the fake clearances she memorized from Sarah. She confessed to the selfies by the fence, the lies at the dinner table. She admitted that every time she sat in this kitchen soaking up their pride and their praise, she felt like a parasite eating them alive. Under the table, I reached over and grabbed Elias's hand. I squeezed his fingers tight enough to break them. I couldn't breathe. I was watching my parents' entire world turn to ash. Daisy stopped talking. She let go of the table and dropped her hands into her lap. She bowed her head, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. The coffee maker gave one final sputtering hiss. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. The air in the kitchen was gone. My mother stumbled backward. Her spine hit the stainless steel refrigerator with a dull, heavy thud. The butter knife slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the linoleum floor. She clamped both hands over her mouth. She didn't scream. She just let out a choked, wet sob. It wasn't a cry of sympathy for her daughter. It was the sound of a woman watching her absolute pride, her most prized possession, shatter into a million worthless pieces. How was she supposed to show her face at the Blue Star Mothers Club now? The glittering crown she had worn for 3 years was made of dirt. But my father was the center of gravity in the room. He didn't yell. He didn't flip the table or curse. He moved with a slow, mechanical precision. He reached up and took off his reading glasses. He folded the plastic arms, setting them gently on top of the local newspaper. He looked down at his own hands resting on the table. They were rough, thick, heavily calloused fingers. The knuckles were permanently stained with dark grease from the machines down at the metal plant. He stared at those hands for a very long time. The hands that had pulled 2 straight years of overnight shifts while his spine deteriorated. Finally, he looked up at Daisy. "You think I swallowed pain pills to work those graveyard shifts?" He started, his voice a gravelly, exhausted rasp. "So I could buy a lie." Daisy shrank into her oversized sweater. She kept her head down. A single tear rolled off her chin and splashed onto the back of her trembling hand. My father placed his palms flat on the wood and slowly pushed himself up. He stood tall despite the pain in his back. "I took that overtime to give you a shot," he said. Every word was sharp, deliberate. "If you failed, you pack your bags and you come home. I need an honest daughter. I don't need a fake officer." My mother pushed away from the refrigerator. She walked over, wrapping her arms around Daisy's shoulders. Daisy buried her face into my mother's stomach, finally letting out a loud, pathetic wail. My father watched them for a second. Then he turned his head. His tired, aging eyes locked onto mine. The disappointment that had clouded his vision for 28 years was completely gone. He saw me. Really saw me. He saw the scars under my shirt. He saw the silence I had kept to protect him. He gave a single, slow nod. "You did the right thing, Jaylene." A hard lump formed in my throat. I had waited my entire life for that look. It was the only validation I ever wanted. But tasting it now, surrounded by the ruins of my family, it was incredibly bitter. Have you ever spent years waiting for your parents to finally see your worth, only to get that validation when everything else was falling apart? If you know exactly how that bitter victory tastes, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Just tell me how old you were when your parents finally admitted you were right. I read all your stories, and it helps to know I'm not the only one. My father shifted his gaze to Elias sitting next to me. He gave another curt nod, a silent thank you to a real man who had quietly protected his daughter when nobody else would. My father turned around and walked out of the kitchen, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floorboards. The trial was over. The old order of the Burton house was dead. Now we had to see what would grow from the ashes. The months that followed felt strange. The house was quieter. The heavy tension that used to choke the life out of the dining room was gone, replaced by a hollow, searching kind of peace. We were all just feeling around in the dark, trying to figure out where to stand. My mother swallowed her pride. She stood in front of the local military mothers club, looked those women in the eye, and told them the truth. Then she stepped down as president. She didn't complain about it once. Daisy didn't run. That was the most surprising part. She quit her mailroom job the very next day. She blocked Sarah Jenkins's number. She started waking up at 5 a.m. to scrub the kitchen floors, do the laundry, and cook breakfast before my father left for his shifts. 3 days a week, she drove him to his physical therapy appointments. She didn't ask for a single thank you. 2 months later, right in the middle of a freezing January, Daisy asked me to come over. I walked through the back door into the kitchen. I stopped dead in my tracks. The long, expensive hair she used to obsess over was gone. She had chopped it all off. It was a short, rough buzz cut that exposed the sharp angles of her jaw. Her face was completely bare of makeup. She looked older, harsher. She was standing by the counter, wiping it down with a damp rag. When she saw me, she tossed the rag into the sink and walked over to the kitchen table. She picked up a crisp, perfectly flat piece of printed paper and slid it across the wood toward me. "I went to the local recruiting office this morning," she said. Her voice wasn't shrill or defensive anymore. It was grounded, quiet. I looked down at the paper. My eyes immediately caught the bold letters printed near the top margin. I read the classification code twice, just to be sure. An E1 contract. I looked up at her, genuinely shocked. Bottom-tier grunt work. "Yes," Daisy answered. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in her entire life, they didn't waver. There was a hard, flinty resolve in them. "I'm not trying for the Leadership Academy again. I don't deserve it. I'm starting at the absolute bottom." She reached out and rested her fingertips on the edge of the paper. "I'm going to earn it this time," she said. from the dirt up. I stared at her. The flashy, arrogant golden child was dead. The girl who bought fake clearances and pretended to be better than everyone else was gone. The person standing in front of me was raw, stripped of all her armor, and heavily flawed. But she was real. I didn't say anything. I just slid the paper back across the table to her. The next morning, the sky was a pale, bruised purple. Elias and I stood in the frozen parking lot of the recruiting office. The wind cut through my coat, carrying the smell of diesel exhaust. We watched from a distance as a small group of recruits lined up in front of a gray bus. Daisy was at the back of the line. She carried a heavy olive-drab duffel bag over one shoulder. She didn't look back. She didn't wave. She just kept her head down, her boots moving in a steady rhythm toward the open doors of the bus, taking her to basic training. Elias slipped his hand into mine, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. I watched the bus doors hiss shut. For the first time in 3 years, I smiled. 6 months later. The graduation field was a massive, unforgiving slab of sun-baked concrete. The July heat beat down mercilessly, radiating off the ground and kicking up the dry, suffocating smell of chalky dust and hot asphalt. Thousands of graduates stood in perfect, rigid blocks, sweating under the heavy sun. I found Daisy in the third row. She was almost unrecognizable. Her skin was baked to a dark, rough bronze. She had leaned out, her cheekbones sharp and defined, stripped of any manufactured softness. A small, jagged scar rested on the left edge of her chin, a permanent souvenir from a nasty fall in the dirt of the training yard. But it was her posture that held my attention. Her spine was locked perfectly straight, like an iron rod. Her eyes stared straight ahead, sharp, clear, and completely focused. The weak, terrified girl who threw her gear in the mud and cried to go home 3 years ago was dead. Up in the hot metal bleachers, Elias draped his arm heavily over my shoulders. He looked out over the sea of green uniforms, his jaw tight. When a wound goes bad, Elias whispered, his voice barely carrying over the low hum of the crowd, you have to cut it wide open. You have to scrape the infection out no matter how much it hurts. It's the only way the tissue actually heals, Jaylene. I reached up and gripped his hand, my thumb tracing his knuckles. He was right. Pushing my sister against the freezing wood of that shed, forcing her to look at her own cowardice, breaking her down to her absolute lowest point. It was the most ruthless thing I had ever done. It was also the only way to save her. A loud horn blasted over the loudspeakers. The final dismissal order echoed across the concrete. The rigid blocks of graduates instantly broke apart as thousands of families flooded the yard, cheering and crying. My father didn't wait for my mother or me. He pushed through the thick crowd. His bad back caused a heavy, uneven limp, but he moved faster than I had seen him move in years. When he reached Daisy, he didn't say a single word. He just threw his thick, heavily calloused hands around her neck and pulled her in tight. He buried his face against her shoulder. When he finally pulled back, his aging, tired eyes were completely red. He was weeping. It was a raw, unfiltered, crushing kind of pride. There were no fake stories standing between them anymore. No ghosts, no stolen honor. Just a mechanic holding a daughter who had finally learned the value of a hard day's work. I walked up to her next. My father stepped back, wiping his eyes with the back of his wrist, giving us space. Daisy immediately snapped her heels together. She stood perfectly still, facing me as a senior investigator and as an older sister. Her chin trembled just a fraction. She was biting the inside of her cheek hard, fighting to keep the tears from spilling over. I didn't offer a dramatic speech. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out the small metal E1 pin. The entry-level insignia. The absolute bottom of the food chain. The metal was cold and heavy against my fingertips. I stepped into her space. My hands moved to the collar of her uniform. I pushed the sharp needles of the pin right through the thick, stiff fabric, securing the metal clasps firmly on the back. I flattened the collar with the palms of my hands and took a slow step back. I looked at the tiny, dull piece of metal resting on her chest. It was absolutely nothing compared to the flashy fake titles she used to brag about at the Thanksgiving table. It carried no elite status, no high-level clearance, but the sheer weight of it was massive, because it was real. She had earned every ounce of it in the dirt, in the heat, and in the truth. Today my sister wasn't just wearing a uniform. She was wearing her courage. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story, and I truly wish you all the strength to face your own hard truths. Goodbye for now.